Why do we do the things we do? Why do we react to stress by shutting down or respond to conflict with anger even when we know it doesn't work? For most of our lives, we are told that our personalities are entirely our own. We believe our anxieties, our fears, and our emotional patterns are just part of who we are. But if you look closer, you begin to realize something profound. You are not just living your life. You are carrying a script that was written long before you were even born. In psychology, we call this intergenerational trauma. In everyday life, it is a generational spell. It is the invisible transmission of emotional pain, coping mechanisms, and unspoken rules passed down from grandparents to parents, and ultimately to you. Consider how a biological organism adapts to its environment. If a tree grows in a harsh, windy climate, its trunk bends to survive. It passes that structural adaptation down. Human families do the exact same thing with emotional survival. If a grandfather survived hardship by suppressing his emotions and becoming cold, he taught his children that vulnerability is dangerous. Those children grew up, became parents, and taught you that expressing your feelings is a sign of weakness. The pain wasn't born with you. You inherited the survival tactics of people who never had the chance to heal. But here is the most critical piece of the puzzle. An inherited pattern is not a life sentence. The spell only works as long as it remains unconscious. The moment you become aware of why you react the way you do, the power dynamics change. You shift from a passive participant in a generational cycle to the author of a new legacy. Ending the spell requires 3 deliberate shifts. First, we must move from blame to understanding. Blaming our parents or ancestors keeps us trapped in the victim mindset. Understanding that they could only give us what they themselves possessed allows us to detach from the pain. They handed you a heavy box because no one ever taught them how to put it down. Second, we must learn to sit with the discomfort of breaking the mold. When you decide to speak truth where there was silence or choose peace where there was chaos, the system will resist you. It feels uncomfortable to change because human beings naturally prefer familiar dysfunction over unfamiliar freedom. You must be willing to endure the temporary discomfort of being the different one in the family. Finally, we must choose intentional reparenting. You must become the person who provides the emotional safety, validation, and boundaries that your family tree lacked. The chain of emotional pain stops the moment someone has the courage to stand up, look at the family history, and say, "This ends with me." It is not easy and it requires immense discipline and self-mastery. But remember, you do not just heal for yourself. You heal to ensure that the next generation inherits a foundation of strength, not a burden of unresolved pain. Fef keynotes of the speech, The Invisible Script. Much of what we consider our personality is actually a set of inherited unconscious emotional patterns and coping mechanisms passed down through generations. The mechanism of survival generational pain is rarely passed down out of malice. It is the transmission of old survival tactics that are no longer useful in the present day. Awareness destroys the cycle. An inherited pattern can only control your behavior as long as it remains unexamined. Awareness is the first step toward breaking the spell. The fiction of familiarity, human minds naturally crave what is familiar, even if it is dysfunctional. Breaking a generational cycle requires resisting the urge to default to familiar habits. The ripple effect of healing. Choosing to heal and break the cycle is an act of leadership that changes the trajectory of your entire future lineage. The invisible script is perhaps the most deceptive force in human psychology because it operates entirely in the shadows of our daily awareness. When we look at our lives, our choices, and our reactions, we naturally want to believe that we are the sole authors of our behavior. We assume that when we feel anxious, or when we push people away, or when we overact to a minor criticism, it is simply a reflection of our current environment or our unique personality. But science and deep psychological study tell a completely different story. We do not enter this world as blank slates. Instead, we are born into an active, ongoing family drama, handed a script that has been edited and rewritten across decades and told to play our part without ever reading the full text. This script is woven directly into our nervous systems long before we have the cognitive ability to question it. From the moment we are born, we absorb the emotional atmosphere of our home. We watch how our parents handle stress, how they communicate love, or how they weaponize silence. If a mother copes with overwhelming stress by shutting down and becoming emotionally unavailable, an infant internalizes that behavior not just as a choice, but as the literal definition of reality. The child's developing brain registers that when things get difficult, the safest option is to disappear. As that child grows into adulthood, they will inevitably find themselves withdrawing from their partner during a hard conversation, completely unaware that they are merely reciting lines from a play written by their mother 20 years prior. The weight of this invisible script becomes even heavier when we realize that it doesn't just dictate how we react to negative events, it actively distorts how we view our own worth and capabilities. It establishes the unwritten rules of what is permissible in a family. For instance, in some families, the script dictates that success is dangerous because it invites envy or judgment. So generations of capable individuals unconsciously self-sabotage their careers the moment they start to outshine their peers. In other families, the script demands total perfection, teaching children that love is highly conditional and must be earned through constant achievement, leading to a lifetime of burnout and chronic anxiety. Because these rules are never spoken aloud, they escape our critical thinking. We don't challenge them because we don't see them as rules. We see them as the absolute truth of how the world works. What makes this intergenerational transmission so profound is how deeply it alters our biological responses. When a parent lives in a state of chronic, unresolved emotional pain or trauma, their baseline for safety is permanently skewed. They pass this heightened state of hypervigilance down to their children through a process of emotional contagion and modeling. As a result, you might find yourself constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, living with a persistent, low-grade sense of dread that you cannot logically explain. You haven't experienced a major catastrophe in your life, yet your body reacts as if it is under constant siege. This is the ultimate manifestation of the invisible script. Your body is literally remembering and reacting to the unresolved fears and heartbreaks of your ancestors. Recognizing the existence of the script is a deeply humbling experience because it forces us to confront the reality that we are far less autonomous than we think. However, this realization is not meant to make us feel powerless. It is meant to liberate us. The danger of an invisible script is not that it exists, but that it operates without our permission. As long as it remains buried in our subconscious, it dictates our career choices, ruins our relationships, and caps our happiness, all while we sit back and blame bad luck or fate. The moment we bring this script into the light, the moment we pause mid-reaction and ask ourselves where a specific fear or behavior actually originated, we strip it of its automatic power. We begin to see that while we did not choose the beginning of our story, we are entirely responsible for how it ends. To understand why we carry the weight of emotional pain, we must first shift our perspective away from blame and toward the cold, hard logic of human survival. When we look back at our family history and see patterns of emotional neglect, explosive anger, or crippling control, our immediate human reaction is to judge it as a moral failing. We wonder how the people who were supposed to care for us could pass down such deeply flawed ways of relating to the world. But if we want to truly break the spell, we have to look past the surface hurt and see the mechanism underneath. Generational pain is almost never passed down out of malice, spite, or a conscious desire to inflict harm. Instead, what we inherit are the calcified survival tactics of people who were forced to adapt to environments of extreme stress, scarcity, or trauma, and who never had the safety or the tools to heal. Every dysfunctional behavior we see in our family trees today was once a highly successful adaptation to a past crisis. Consider the grandfather who grew up in the shadow of poverty or war. In his world, showing vulnerability, crying, or admitting fear could quite literally get him killed or ruin his chances of keeping his family alive. To survive, his nervous system made a necessary trade. Off it shut down his emotional sensitivity and turned up his emotional armor. He became stoic, cold, and rigidly controlled. In the context of his actual life circumstances, that armor was a brilliant strategy for survival. It kept him moving forward when everything around him was falling apart. The tragedy, however, is that human beings are incredibly efficient at passing down survival strategies, but terrible at recognizing when the war is finally over. When that grandfather has children, he does not leave his armor at the door. He raises his children using the exact same playbook that kept him alive. He teaches his son that expressing sadness is a dangerous weakness and that security only comes through absolute control. The son grows up in a relatively safe, modern environment, but his internal programming is still wired for a battlefield. Because he has never known anything else, he passes this hyper-vigilant, emotionally distant style of parenting down to his own children. By the time that coping mechanism reaches you, the original context, the poverty, the war, the immediate physical threat has completely vanished. You are left holding a massive, heavy shield on a sunny day, completely exhausted by its weight, wondering why your family is so obsessed with protection when there is nothing left to fight. This is the core tragedy of the generational transmission of pain. We are constantly applying outdated solutions to entirely new environments. A coping mechanism is simply a shield that became permanent. When a parent uses explosive anger to dominate a household, it is often because they grew up in a chaotic environment where the only way to avoid being victimized was to become the loudest, most terrifying force in the room. When a parent uses extreme guilt or manipulation to keep their children close, it is usually because their own childhood was defined by sudden abandonment and a profound lack of stability. They aren't trying to hurt you, they're trying to manage their own unexamined, terrifying fears of isolation or powerlessness, using the only tools they were ever given. They handed you a heavy, broken box because no one ever took the time to show them how to open it, inspect its contents, and put it down. When we realize that our family's dysfunction is actually just old, unhealed survival machinery running on autopilot, something profound changes inside us. The anger we feel begins to give way to a deep, grounded understanding. We stop looking at our parents as malicious actors who deliberately chose to compromise our emotional well-being, and we start seeing them as wounded children who grew up to become wounded adults, trapped inside an inheritance they didn't ask for either. They could only give us what they themselves possessed. They couldn't teach us emotional regulation because their own nervous systems were constantly stuck in a state of fight or flight. They couldn't give us unconditional validation because they spent their entire lives trying to earn their own worth. Seeing this mechanism clearly does not excuse the hurt they caused, but it does strip that hurt of its personal nature. It allows us to realize that the pain was never really about us. It was just the echo of an old battle that we are finally being given the opportunity to stop fighting. The true turning point in any generational cycle does not begin with an external event or a massive lifestyle shift. It begins in the quiet, often agonizing moment of pure awareness. For generations, the emotional patterns of a family tree operate with absolute authority precisely because they are hidden in plain sight. They exist as the default setting of the household, the unquestioned reality of how life is supposed to be lived. When a behavior is normalized for decades, it gains a form of invisibility. If everyone in your family tree handles anxiety by lashing out or treats vulnerability as a dangerous flaw, then doing those things doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like human nature. The spell remains completely unbroken as long as it stays safely buried in the subconscious mind, driving your actions while you remain completely blind to its influence. The moment you bring awareness to these patterns, the entire power dynamic of the family system undergoes a violent shift. Awareness acts as a wedge driven directly between a stimulus and your automatic response. In a typical generational cycle, when a trigger occurs, such as a partner expressing disappointment or a boss giving critical feedback, the inherited program instantly fires. Your nervous system bypasses your conscious mind, defaulting straight to the ancestral defense mechanism, whether that means exploding in anger, shutting down emotionally, or running away. But when you develop awareness, you create a microscopic pause right after the trigger occurs. In that pause, you stop being a passive actor playing out an old script and you become an observer. You look at your sudden urge to scream or hide, and instead of executing the command, you question it. You ask yourself, is this intense reaction truly mine, or am I just echoing the exact way my father reacted 30 years ago? This conscious examination acts like a solvent on the glue that holds generational trauma together. An inherited emotional pattern requires your total blind compliance to survive. It relies on you being asleep at the wheel so it can use your body and your voice to keep itself alive for another generation. The second you look at the pattern directly and name it for what it is, it loses its automated control over you. You begin to realize that just because a reaction is familiar does not mean it is necessary. And just because a thought pops into your head does not mean it represents objective reality. You start to see the distinction between who you actually are and the survival mechanisms you were taught to adopt. This is the moment where true choice is born. You realize you are no longer obligated to protect the dysfunction of the past at the expense of your own peace. However, developing this level of awareness is not a gentle or comforting process. It requires an immense amount of radical honesty and the willingness to look at your own flaws without flinching. It is easy to point fingers at the generations that came before us and notice their obvious shortcomings. It is infinitely harder to sit quietly with ourselves and admit how much of their darkness we have allowed to take root inside our own hearts. Awareness demands that we track our own manipulation, our own emotional coldness, or our own toxic habits back to their roots. It forces us to acknowledge that while we are victims of an inherited environment, we also risk becoming the perpetrators of that same environment if we refuse to wake up. Once this awareness is unlocked, it can never be truly undone. You can no longer comfortably participate in the family drama or engage in toxic dynamics without a persistent internal alarm going off. You become hyper-aware of the subtle ways your family system tries to pull you back into your old assigned role. When you choose to remain conscious in the face of these pressures, you are actively rewriting your neural pathways and dismantling a legacy of suffering. You begin to understand that awareness is not just a psychological tool, it is a profound act of defiance. It is the definitive line in the sand where you look back at centuries of unresolved emotional pain and declare that its momentum stops with you. To understand why breaking a generational cycle is so profoundly difficult, we must confront one of the most unsettling truths about human psychology. The human mind does not naturally seek happiness, peace, or balance. Instead, the human mind craves what is familiar. From an evolutionary standpoint, familiarity equals safety. To our primitive nervous system, a familiar environment, no matter how toxic, chaotic, or emotionally draining it might be, represents a known quantity. Your brain looks at a familiar pattern of dysfunction and thinks, we have survived this before, so we can survive it again. On the other hand, unfamiliar territory, even if it is filled with love, emotional safety, and peace, represents a dangerous unknown. Consequently, when we attempt to heal and change our lives, our greatest enemy is not the family members trying to hold us back. It is our own deeply ingrained instinct to default to the predictable misery of the past. This fiction of familiarity creates a powerful psychological gravity that pulls us back into old habits the moment we try to step away. Consider someone who grew up in a household defined by constant conflict and unpredictable emotional outbursts. For that individual, chaos is their baseline. Their nervous system becomes calibrated to a high level of stress and drama. When they grow up and enter a healthy, stable relationship where conflict is handled with calm communication, they will often feel deeply uncomfortable. Instead of feeling relieved, they feel anxious, bored, or suspicious. Because peace feels unfamiliar, their mind interprets it as a sign that something is wrong. Unconsciously, they may begin to pick fights or sabotage the relationship just to recreate the familiar atmosphere of conflict they grew up with. They mistake the absence of drama for an absence of passion, completely unaware that they are just desperately trying to make their present look like their past. Breaking a generational spell requires us to deliberately resist this urge to default to what feels natural. We have to understand that when we first start setting boundaries, practicing emotional regulation, or demanding respect, It is going to feel deeply unnatural. It will feel wrong, uncomfortable, and almost terrifying. Many people give up on their healing journey because they assume that if a new behavior feels awkward or induces anxiety, it must mean they are doing something wrong. But the exact opposite is true. That intense discomfort is the feeling of your brain building entirely new neural pathways. It is the feeling of your nervous system learning to tolerate a level of peace that it has never experienced before. You have to be willing to endure the temporary agony of the unfamiliar if you ever want to achieve genuine freedom. This struggle becomes even more complicated when we realize that our families will often actively weaponize this craving for familiarity against us. Human family units operate like complex, finely tuned machines. Every member has an assigned role to play to keep the machine running smoothly, even if the machine is completely broken. When you decide to step out of your assigned role, when you refuse to participate in the gossip, refuse to accept the emotional abuse, or start speaking up where there was once only compliance, the entire machine begins to shake. The family system will experience your healing as an existential threat. They will consciously or unconsciously try to pull you back into the old familiar dynamics using guilt, shame, or exclusion. They will tell you that you have changed, that you are being selfish, or that you think you are better than them. Resisting that immense social and familial pressure requires an extraordinary level of discipline and self-mastery. It means choosing to be the villain in their story so that you can be the hero in your own. It means accepting that you might have to walk alone through the unfamiliar wilderness of your own life for a while before you find a community that aligns with your new baseline of health and maturity. We must constantly remind ourselves that familiarity is a liar. It promises comfort but only delivers a repetition of the same old heartbreaks. The moment we stop confusing what is familiar with what is right, we break the spell. We give ourselves permission to build a completely new version of reality, one where peace is no longer a terrifying stranger, but the very foundation upon which we stand. When we make the difficult decision to confront our inherited emotional pain and actively change our behavior, we often view it as a deeply private, internal struggle. We focus entirely on our own relief, our own relationships, and our own immediate peace of mind. But when you step back and look at the broader architecture of human life across generations, you realize that choosing to heal is never a solitary act. It is a profound act of leadership that sends a massive psychological shockwave both backward and forward through time. The moment you stand up and refuse to pass down the trauma, the neglect, or the toxic coping mechanisms that were handed to you, you are not just fixing your own life. You are actively altering the entire trajectory of your genetic and emotional lineage, ensuring that the generations who come after you will inherit a foundation of genuine strength rather than a heavy burden of unresolved pain. To fully grasp the magnitude of this ripple effect, we have to look at the invisible architecture of a family tree. Every choice made by an ancestor leaves a lingering emotional footprint. When a grandparent or a parent chooses to hide from their pain, to numb it with substances, or to project it onto their children through anger and control, they are essentially taking their emotional debt and kicking it down the road for someone else to pay. That debt doesn't just disappear, it accumulates interest, compounding over decades until it lands squarely in the lap of someone who finally has the courage to look at the bill. If you do not do the heavy lifting of paying off that emotional debt through self-mastery, awareness, and deliberate healing, you will inevitably pass the invoice directly to your children. You will repeat the same subtle cruelties, the same emotional absences, and the same rigid expectations that broke your own spirit when you were young. This is why healing is the ultimate form of generational responsibility. When you do the hard, uncomfortable work of re-parenting yourself, learning how to regulate your nervous system, and setting healthy boundaries, you are actively filtering the toxic water of your family stream. You become a biological and emotional circuit breaker. The next generation will grow up in an environment where they do not have to spend their adulthood unlearning their childhood. They will not have to waste decades of their lives trying to figure out why they feel fundamentally unlovable or why they are terrified of vulnerability. Because you had the courage to face the darkness, they get to grow up in the light, they get to start their lives miles ahead of where you started yours, building upon a legacy of emotional clarity, open communication, and psychological safety. Furthermore, this ripple effect extends far beyond your biological descendants. It completely transforms how you show up in the world right now. When you break a generational cycle, you change the way you interact with everyone around you. You stop projecting your historical wounds on your friends, your colleagues, and your romantic partners. You become a stabilizing force in a chaotic world. People who encounter you will sense a groundedness and an authenticity that can only be forged in the fires of deep self-examination. By changing your own baseline from a state of hyper-vigilant survival to one of intentional, peaceful existence, you quietly grant permission to everyone in your orbit to do the exact same thing. We must discard the toxic cultural narrative that working on your mental health and confronting family trauma is a selfish or self-indulgent pursuit. It is quite literally the most selfless thing a human being can do. It requires you to look into the abyss of your family's history, absorb the impact of the pain that was unjustly inflicted upon you, and consciously choose to absorb that energy so it goes no further. You are choosing to let the pain transform you into someone wiser, kinder, and more resilient, rather than letting it transmit through you into the future. This is how true legends are made in family histories. Decades from now, Children who will never know your specific struggles and who will never fully understand the weight of the chains you had to break will walk through their lives with a profound sense of freedom and security, entirely unaware that their emotional wealth was bought and paid for by the quiet, disciplined choices you are making today. Ultimately, breaking the generational spell is a choice between the comfort of the past and the freedom of the future. It is the realization that while you cannot change the beginning of your story, you are entirely responsible for how it ends. The emotional pain you inherited was never your fault, but healing it is your responsibility. By stepping out of the shadows of old survival tactics, embracing radical awareness, and enduring the temporary discomfort of building a new baseline, you do something extraordinary. You stop the bleeding in your family tree. You stand as the definitive line in the sand, turning past trauma into future wisdom. Do not look back at the chaos with resentment. Look forward with the fierce determination of a leader. Choose discipline over default. Choose healing over survival. Stand up, reclaim your script, and let the unresolved pain of generations finally end with you.